Welcome to Love for the Truth Radio, a program devoted to encouraging you to be a contender of the faith in an ever-changing church culture. On Love for the Truth Radio, we will discuss current issues and challenging views along with biblical truth that can affect our Christian worldview and how we live out our faith. And now, here's your host, Cindy Hartline.
Welcome to another program of Love for the Truth Radio. You know, many would agree that there's an obvious spiritual political agenda for global oneness. But did you know that it's a quest to move toward a new world order? Well, our guests will confirm that truth. And in our previous radio show with James Joseph Fire, we addressed biblical prophecy about the one world order and how it is currently in fruition, setting the stage for the Antichrist. Be sure to check that featured show out on loveforthetruthradio.com. That's loveforthetruthradio.com. And today we will be discussing the details of how the quest for global oneness has been on a worldwide agenda for decades, and the cult of world order and spiritual politics, all of which are chapters found in truth-revealing book, Game of Gods, the Temple of Man in the Age of Re-Enchantment. You will be on the edge of your seat this entire show, so you'll want to get comfortable. Carl Teichrib is a researcher, writer, and lecturer focusing on the paradigm shift sweeping the Western world, including challenges and opportunities faced by Christians. Over the years, Carl has attended a range of internationally significant political, religious, and social events in his quest to understand the historical and contemporary forces of transformation, including the Parliament of the World's Religions, Burning Man, and the United Nations Millennium Forum. Since the mid-1990s, Carl's research has been utilized by numerous authors, media hosts, documentary producers, pastors, professors, and students, and interested lay people. From 2007 until the end of 2015, Carl edited a monthly web-based magazine, Forcing Change. I know you probably heard of that. We spoke of that years ago, documenting and detailing the worldview revolution underway, points of pressure, and forces of change. Carl Teichrib frequently speaks to church groups and conference settings and occasionally teaches a modular course on secular pagan trends at, I believe it's Miller College of the Bible. And Carl's biases are transparent. He embraces an evangelical Christian perspective, is pro-liberty versus politically imposed equality, pro-individualistic versus consensuous collectivism, and pro-free market. And I hope I didn't tongue twist all that. But anyway, Carl is an amazing man. His book is one of my favorites. I'm sure you'll hear a lot about his book during this show, Game of Gods, the Temple of Man in the Age of Re-Enchantment. And again, pay attention to every detail, so get comfortable. And I'd like to welcome Carl Teichrib, a very amazing man of God and a friend of ours. Welcome, Carl.
Well, Cindy, thank you, and thank you for the introduction. Wow, yeah, thank you. It was over the top, but really, I'm honored to be on your show and thankful to be on your show. And we're going to have a lot of stuff to talk about.
A lot of stuff, and that's why we're going to get to it right away, Carl. I just got to get yourself comfortable here. In chapter 1 of your book called Visions of One, you shared how in April 1997, you attended an event called the Global Citizenship 2000 Youth Congress in Vancouver. You said it was a time of dreaming, anticipation, for visioneering, a call to embed, I'm getting tongue twisters here, a planetary philosophy is expressed through the World Core curriculum into Canada's education system, which is amazing, and thus shape a generation of global citizens. I read that their attention was to assert oneness, and that's especially in that youth gathering there. Why don't you share your experiences? Carl, it's amazing. I just have to say this to our listeners, is that you always find Carl in remote places. So it's like, how did he get there? But anyway, share your experience of what happened there and the meaning of being a global citizen.
Well, yes, this is a good starting point. For me, that event was the first internationalist event I had ever attended. I was doing research on a serious hobby level to try to understand globalization, to try to understand world transformation. But I had not done any boots on the ground research. I hadn't gone to any conferences. I hadn't been to any settings besides simply the academic work of going through the books, the literature, the reports, that type of thing. So this was my first time back in 1997 to attend boots on the ground, an event that had international significance. And what hit me as I walked away from it and during that event itself was how ready the hearts and minds were of young people, because this was an event geared towards youth. It was a young people's event looking to shape Canada's education system so that our children would accept oneness and the idea of global citizenship as their ultimate calling, as their meaning, as their purpose, as their destiny. And what was remarkable was the event organizers had brought in Robert Mueller, who has now passed away. I believe he passed away in 2010. But Robert Mueller was a long-time high official at the United Nations. And Robert Mueller made it very clear that what we were doing was we were discovering our own divinity. We were all becoming one with each other. We were becoming one with the planet. We were all working for Mother Earth. All of our allegiances and loyalties were to be directed to our mother. You are no longer citizens of Canada. You are citizens of the world. That was what was coming out. And then, Cindy, the response from the children was interesting. We had a Q&A session where a girl, she couldn't have been any older than 14, stood up and she was weeping because we have an environmental crisis, and it's because of overpopulation. And she was calling through her tears. She was calling for the end of children. Here was a child saying we needed to end children to save the planet. So it was super emotional, very it really had a sense of a feeling. You walked away from it going, there's a lot of energy and emotion and a lot of there's a sensation here that they are working towards something far bigger than themselves. And that's the idea of oneness. Yeah.
And, and that's how you see these type of, I would say it's an influential kind of speech that will gear people into a different direction, and a lot of it is played on fear. Now, this Robert Mueller definitely was very influential towards this global oneness and being a global citizen, and we all have to come together with our hearts and minds and feel the same thing and experience the same thing to go in the same direction. But, we're seeing a lot of this even recently. I want you to give us an example of how other influential people ultimately sell a feeling, to take our culture on this global path. I believe you had mentioned Oprah.
Oh, well, Oprah's a great example because Oprah goes into the homes of millions of people. Yes. And you can look back at, particularly to one event, and I bring this out and I kind of explored a little bit in the book. And that was back in 2009 when Oprah brought on Eckhart Tolle to talk about a new Earth. And it was a 10-part webcast. What was interesting is the amount of people that were logged in. Approximately 11 million people had logged in to watch the 2009 series. And in a short period of time, it had been viewed, I think, over 35 million times. In fact, there was a comment made by a couple of different authors that really this event, this web series between Oprah and Eckhart, could rightly be called one of the 10 largest spiritual gatherings in recorded history because of the numbers of people tuning in, and because the message all the way through consistently was about oneness, and even how it was expressed, it was all looking to try to understand a higher consciousness, connecting yourself into this larger movement of consciousness. You are all in the now, and you can all feel yourself being one. You can feel your interconnection. You can feel that you are connected to all people everywhere. And it was a very spiritual / emotional / feelings based experience, and the whole world was tuning in. I mean, not the whole world. I mean, literally, but in the sense
Millions, yeah.
of the world of influence.
Yes.
The world was tuned in, and the world was was buying this feeling of oneness, and we were really seeing the merchandising of a spiritual, emotional feeling, and that feeling becomes the basis for so many conceptions, so many people's conceptions of truth. Well, it has to be true because I felt this way.
Yes. Yeah. And I believe I read this a while ago that Oprah had about 4 million people following her in this whole New Age kind of theory that was going on. And what's his name? Eckhart Tolle, he is understood and known as a very powerful New Age minister.
Right.
So this is something that, we have to be careful of, especially when you see a lot of Christians even watching Oprah, following her in her ways. But anyway, let's conclude this, Carl, by saying, in your words, why don't you define what global oneness is very simply so that our listeners can walk away understanding it?
Oh, sure. Global oneness is this feeling which is really based on a sense of a tolerance for all things, and you feel that you are connected in. You are now tolerant of all things. You see that there are no ultimate divisions within and between humanity. That it goes beyond that. There's no ultimate division between you and nature. There's no ultimate division between you and God.
That's interesting. Very well said. It's interesting that you said it's a feeling of tolerance in all things. And I think that's what we're seeing, not to bring in the political thing, but we're seeing this in our culture even now being exposed, that if we're not tolerant in all things, then there's this, I would say this like power or something to come against, that if you're not tolerant, then you're out. You're not part of us.
Right. If you're not tolerant, and there's a proper tolerance and understanding what tolerance means, but then there is now the emotionally charged political understanding of tolerance, which is you have to accept.
There it is.
And endorse all things, and this is a very, very powerful, kind of a battering ram against Christianity, because when we say that no, I mean, there are distinctions, there are differences. In fact, God's word makes it very, very clear there are distinctions. As soon as you bring that into play, you're viewed as separating.
Yes,
you're viewed as causing division.
Right.
When you are no longer tolerant, you must be the ones who are engaging in bringing about conflict, because you are now separating. And so they wield that stick against the Christian message, and it has had a devastating effect. It
has had a devastating effect on the church. Rather than the church being the light to a dark world and expose philosophies that oppose God's word, the Bible, the church has been affected and influenced by the one world philosophy of tolerance. And we're seeing this in a lot of churches today that are accepting the LBGQ, goes on and on agenda, because they want to be a part of this tolerance. Give us examples of how this is playing out in our churches, Carl.
Oh, golly.
Oh, geez.
The examples are really endless. I'll bring one example down at a local level. We have a local church. It's within a driving radius of where I live by about an hour and a half. And this church is having, this fall, had an interfaith prayers to save Mother Earth.
Wow.
And this church also brings in Buddhist teachers, so that on Sunday afternoons, after the Sunday church service is done, then you can go do your Buddhist meditations.
Wow. Well, we're going on a break, Carl, so we'll address this on the other side of the break, all right? So please stay tuned. We'll be talking about the cult of world order. We'll be right back.
If you're a first-time listener, you'll find that on Love for the Truth Radio, we discuss news and views from a biblical worldview. We believe that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God and the absolute truth that should be applied to every aspect of life. We don't proclaim to have a cap on the truth, but we do have a love for biblical truth. So please, take everything you hear on this radio program to study and prayer. And thank you for listening to Love for the Truth Radio.
Welcome back. Over the years, Carl Teichrib, author of Game of Gods, The Temple of Man and Age of Re-Enchantment, has attended a range of internationally significant political, religious, and social events in his quest to understand the historical and contemporary forces of transformation. I said that before in our intro, including the Parliament of the World's Religions, Burning Man, and United Nations Millennium Forum. Carl has a lot to say, and in the next two segments, I'd like to focus on his chapter 11 of his book, The Cult of World Order. But first, we're going to continue. Carl, I'd like to, I know we cut you off before that break, but if you'd like to add anything else about examples of how this tolerance is playing out in our churches, why don't you continue in that?
Sure. Well, I was just bringing out one local example for us, and that was it's a church that embraces everything. It seems to the point of really you begin to question then what do you actually believe as a church. Mm-hmm. And so this fall it had a sign outside of its building saying that they would have an interfaith prayer gathering for saving Mother Earth, for climate change, and then the last little while they've been announcing in the local paper that you can come after the church service and sit and do Buddhist meditations on Sunday evening or Sunday afternoons after the church service, and it's a major national denomination across Canada. It's the United Church of Canada, and if you want to see an example of where the church, which at one point it was historically, theologically a stronger church. What's interesting is the recognition that really by the 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s, there was a recognition that the whole idea of the exclusive message of Jesus Christ, that the fact that separates, that really does separate out, is almost an embarrassment in an age when we have to become tolerant of all things. And so this denomination, it's really interesting because I spend a lot of time, and I know this segment deals, if you want to talk about world order, what's interesting is I've been to a number of World Federalist events, and many times I've ran into people, including at the organizational level, who are ministers in the United Church or who have some other direct connection into the United Church. That's so it has that denomination has a very international mindset, but they're not the only ones. Cindy, you can see examples of this everywhere.
Yeah, we are. And the thing is, if we don't know, if we're not aware of it, we can get caught right into it. In the first segment, we didn't get a chance to talk about the world-mindedness and the vision of the anointed, our modern salvation message of a unified world culture. If you want to touch on that, be great. But this is in your book, you talk about a new spirituality. And I think this is kind of what we're talking about, is that whether churches realize it or not, or well, they should, because if they're following the word of God, they will have the discernment to see that this is indeed going towards a new world order, but they shouldn't fall prey to the mindset of it, this world-mindedness, so that's interesting. Did you want to touch on that real quick, and then we'll go ahead to your opening chapter of your book?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought the question of the vision of the anointed. That's a term
huge.
That's a term that Thomas Sowell, a very brilliant economist, would use in describing those organizations, those men and women who believe very strongly that their view of creating a utopian world system, kind of a utopian paradise on earth through economics, through global governance, whatever it may be, they believe that they are the anointed ones who can push forward for that progressive vision. Now, what's interesting is in late 2018, I was at the Parliament of World Religions, which is as much about politics as it is about religion. And what was fascinating of what they were doing was they were involved in putting together a package that would save the world. They were involved directly in the salvation of the planet and the salvation of humanity. They didn't hide that. In fact, one of the closing statements in the closing speeches was all about how, in fact, they were thanking us, literally thanking us in the audience for we had been involved now in working towards the salvation of the world. It's that progressive, leftist, global-minded sense that we have the vision. We have the vision to create heaven on earth, and we are the anointed ones who.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting that just as the enemy is the counterfeit, of course, he's going to have a counterfeit salvation of humanity. And I think you said it right. The progressive leftists, that's their mindset, and you could see it playing out in every area, especially in our politics today. Probably don't want to go there. But anyway, I want to move on, Carl, into the opening. Let's just move on.
Yeah.
Into the opening of that chapter. We read a quote from, I don't know if I'm going to say his name right, but it's Haridus T. Mazumdar. Is that how you say it? The old world is dead. Okay, his quote is, "The old world is dead. Let the new one arise from its ashes. Arise, the new world order shall." What immediately comes to my mind is the counterfeit agenda, which I just spoke about, which is in competition with God, establishing his kingdom in preparation of the new heaven and earth. In this chapter, you do share your experiences as an independent participant in the United Nations Millennium Forum, actually, which is amazing. Carl finds himself in another very remote forum somewhere, but where there was 1,400 other participants from around the world that assembled there under the banner of "We the People." So here we're seeing this political agenda along with the salvation of humanity. Why don't you share the experiences and basically what you learned from that world order envisioned for the 21st century?
Absolutely. And I break this down in chapter 11 of my book, which, and I entitled the chapter "The Cult of World Order," because I want my readers to understand that what we're talking about, when we're talking about global governance, what we're really talking about is an alternative salvation plan. And that alternative salvation comes through a global political authority. So we no longer place our faith in God, but we have what really is a God substitute. Sure. It really becomes a political religion. And that's important for people to wrap their heads around. This isn't just simply utilitarian politics. This is a type of salvation through politics. And at the United Nations Millennium Forum, I was on subgroup 6, which we had a series of different working groups. And subgroup 6 was a working group to restructure world order, to see what world order would look like in the new millennium, what the hopes and aspirations were. And where it really went down, the path was what we need is a form of global governance, world government. That was very openly expressed. We need a global tax. We talked a lot about creating a carbon tax. We need an internationally mandated military police force under the auspices of the United Nations Secretary General Office. We need a global criminal system. At this point, the International Criminal Court was really starting to come into its own, come into fruition. There was a lot of push towards that. And what we were talking about as a group, and I'm saying we because I'm on that working group. Okay. Yeah. And I'm sitting there observing, watching, taking a lot of notes, because golly, it's heavy duty stuff, and you've got to wrap your head around this. You're in a workshop room with anywhere from 80 to 100 people, all representing non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, international organizations, all of them with the same vision of we need to create a new world order, a global political authority that will help save humanity and save the earth. What was interesting, Cindy, was they didn't always agree with each other. In fact, we had a situation, and I documented in the book, where one of the afternoons was to talk about constructing a global parliament, a global political parliament. It would be for your American audience, it would be like having a world Congress, and just how everybody that was there was on board with this agenda, but everybody had a different view of how it should get fleshed out, who would be on top of it. And you realize that after, I think it was like a 3-hour meeting, it was very, very heated. They all have this grand vision, and they all have big egos and want to be kind of the king of the hill and make their grand vision work. And I realized watching as there was so much infighting, there was so much tension in the room, that they don't always get along. And this is something that you don't see unless you actually put boots on the ground, and you realize as they're viewing the creation of their salvation of the world through global politics, at this point, they don't get along themselves. They're really wrestling with it. We need one type of a crisis and one type of a figure, I think, to unite everything.
Yeah, I would agree with you with that, and it's interesting because, like you were saying, it's that we see this global governing, actually, we've heard about the carbon tax already, and trying to, everything that you had mentioned, we see this kind of in progress in some way or another, whether it's from political talk or whatever. But I do want to move on because we do have a lot to cover. And if you feel like you don't want to cover everything, that's fine. We can just make note of it. But I want you to, if you can, brief us on the collective voice of the NGOs. Who are they?
Oh, yeah.
How are they defining the age of globalization? You said that they're establishing a new pathway, a voice of global conscious, authenticated for the visionary construction of the futures. I think they're playing a big part. At least that's what it seemed like they did when I was reading your book. So if you want to briefly talk about that.
It's huge. I mean, the non-governmental organizations are almost like the fourth branch of government, in that and then you could define non-governmental organizations, and there's all kinds of ways of defining them, Cindy. Mm-hmm. But you can define it this way, especially in this context, as global pressure groups. So these are organizations. They could be United Nations-based organizations. They're civil society groups. They're foundations. They can be think tanks. Mm-hmm. They are nonprofit organizations, and because they're nonprofit organizations, they are viewed as having more moral superiority. They have a moral voice, a higher moral voice. It's an entire it's an entire industry of these pressure groups promoting and pushing for world order and international governance. It's a reality.
It is a reality. We're going on break. We'll be right back with Carl Teichrib, The Cult of World Order. Stay tuned.
Many would agree that we are living in unprecedented times. Grave immorality is on the rise, as in the days of Noah and Sodom and Gomorrah. There are wars and rumors of wars as nations rise against nations. Prophecy is being fulfilled as the birth pangs become quicker and harder. These are the signs of the return of Jesus Christ. There is one sign often left untaught. Jesus also told the disciples in the Olivet Discourse to take heed that no man deceive you. This warning applies to us too. Deception has infiltrated the churches through many false teachings and movements, making apostasy paramount. As contenders of the faith, we do our best to research and discuss these false teachings for you, the listener. Thank you for having a love for the truth.
Well, we're back with Carl Teichrib. This has been so exciting, at least for me. I'm always on the edge of my seat that we can't seem to get enough in, Carl. So anyway, I do want to move on to whether people realize it or not that there has been a political agenda and push for this New World Order. Can you read George H.W. Bush's New World Order statement? I think we need to hear that because maybe there's those that didn't know or realize that this is something that our previous president had said.
Sure, I can give you a couple of statements, but I'll give you the one that was quite famous.
Okay.
And this is a statement that was made back in 1991. What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind, peace and security, freedom and the rule of law. Such is a world worthy of our struggle and worthy of our children's future. That was a very, very famous statement, especially the first part of it. What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order. That statement, a new world order, he used that phrase over and over and over again. To the point, Cindy, what's interesting, to the point where I saw a number of political commentaries and heard different political commentators saying, well, he coined the phrase because he said it so often. No, he didn't coin the phrase. Yeah. In fact, this language predates him by generations. In the modern context, President Reagan back in 1982 talked about how we have to strive together to build a new world order which guarantees the political justice, economic justice, and social justice. That's a direct statement, by the way. In 77, President Carter said something very similar about we need to create a new world order for global solutions. Way back, FDR talked about it in the negative, describing Adolf Hitler's global aspirations as his new world order. It's been around for a long, long time. In fact, you can find where this language is used specifically in the 1870s. In the 1870s, through the Baha'i faith, as the founder of the Baha'i faith talked about, and he spoke about this favorably, as a coming new world order, and that would be a universalist system, a uniform system where we would have a global parliament, a single religion, we would have collective security, a universal system of currency. We would all recognize our oneness.
Isn't that interesting? And, rather, when you look at this, you see this counterfeit thing going on. Rather than a common salvation that gives us peace and security in Christ, we're seeing this common cause. Basically, we see in the natural and the flesh, it's, not really spiritual, that will bring peace and security. I want to talk about the church and the rise of liberal theology and the social gospel movement en route toward the New World Order, Carl, because that's basically what has to happen for this new world order to take place, is they have to get everybody on this same common ground as far as religion. So why don't we just give us a little bit of information on the liberal theology and the social gospel movement?
Well, I'm glad you want to touch on this, because people need to understand that there is a context here that goes back a long ways. What we're talking about is not something that has just simply emerged in the last little while. It has been in play for a long time. So I can take you back, and I documented in the book, I can take you back to World War I. Where already, even before World War I, the social gospel movement comes into its own before World War I. And then during World War I, you had major social gospel ministers, men like Frederick Lynch, who ended up spending time with Andrew Carnegie's group, helped put together the Carnegie Church Peace Union. He worked with the Federal Council of Churches. Lynch and others like him, Samuel Zane Batten was another one, talked openly about how the social gospel really was the gospel of creating a new world order. In fact, Batten had his 1919 book entitled The New World Order. And this is what Batten, who was a minister, an American Baptist minister and a social gospel campaigner, this is what Samuel Zane Batten said: if there's to be a new world, it must come first of all through a new spirit in the nations. There must be created an international mind and consciousness. Men must learn to think of humanity as one family and to have a world patriotism. They must keep their minds free from jealousy and selfishness and base their policy and practice upon true and Christian principles. That sounds all great, but this is how he describes it. They must be quick to resent injustice by a nation as by an individual. And here's where it becomes interesting. Humanity must become an ideal in order that it may become an actuality. World patriotism must be a faith, a chivalry, before it can become an organization. International peace must become an aspiration, a religion, before it will become a reality. And it goes on and on and on. Okay. This sounds great. He's saying we need Christian principles. And that was the language. We need Christian principles. This is a Christian duty to create a new world order. And in fact, the language at that point was what we need is a brotherhood of man that would come through a type of righteous internationalism. We would literally be creating heaven on earth. That was the language that was being employed. And we would do this by having a world patriotism, this new faith, a new religion of international peace. And I mean, this is back
amazing.
already in. Yeah, this is back in World War I, and the church was embracing this. And you know, you jump into what happened at World War II and the creation of the United Nations, and you see very similarly, you see a lot of church organizations, especially social gospel church groups, coming on board and saying, yes, what we need to save humanity, what we need, desperately what we need, is a world government, a world authority. And so this movement is not divorced from the Christian community. The Christian community in this sense, and this is a broad umbrella view of the Christian community, but the Christian community at that point was saying, we support a world order. We support an international authority. It's the only way that we're going to have salvation. Cindy, there were back in World War II, there were entire denominations engaged in letter writing campaigns to the U.S. federal government saying we need world government. There were world government Sundays where pastors were being pressured to preach messages affirming world government from their pulpits. And this was being done because they believed our salvation would come through world unity.
That's so interesting. You know, you look at this, Carl, and you see that how world patriotism is with a new faith, you know, and like you said, a new spirituality. So here we're seeing the politics mixing with church, you know, and I see this in the church today. I don't want to really go into and talk about, but you see the social gospel, you know, that rose up in the last years, where, you know, they have this, let's go out and help everybody, but they don't really give the gospel of truth or the gospel with it. But it's amazing. It's amazing that it started back in World War I. And I like the fact that you were saying that they were saying that you have to change the minds of the people. Well, what does the Lord say? Repent and change your mind for me. So you see this counterfeit constantly, continuously rising up. You know, and I do want to highlight the social and political salvation of certain groups. If you want to talk about just briefly about the global parliament, the political temple of man, and international court or world police force that would usher in the kingdom. If you want to touch on that, Carl, briefly, that would be great.
Yeah, well, you know, this is interesting because this is really the merger of politics and religion at an international level, and people need to realize that the two go hand in hand. So, for an example, at the 2018 Parliament, I heard on different occasions the need and necessity of creating a world government, a world parliament, and working alongside of religious leaders. In fact, the Parliament of World Religions itself, in a way, is supposed to be giving religious and moral authority to the idea of creating one world. And so the religious leaders themselves are on board with this concept. Back in 2010, I was at the G8 World Religions Summit, and there you had a multitude of different faiths. You had faith leaders from around the world. You had Christians. You had Hindus. You had members of the Baha'i community. The list went on. Wow. All of them talking about how what we need is we need to empower the United Nations. We need to empower a world authority. We need to have global governance. And I'm thinking to myself, you're all religious leaders. Why is this such a focus? Yeah. Why is this something you so strongly desire? The understanding was this, and this is really important, Cindy, and your listeners need to grasp this. It was recognized that as religious leaders, they had a larger audience, their constituents, their religious bodies. They have a larger constituency than some nations, than some governments do. So, and that their religious voice goes around the world. It surpasses national boundaries. So if you can get your constituents on board, if you can get your lay people on board to support some aspect of progressive political and social agendas, you are now engaging in what would be considered a type of spiritual politics.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I could see that. And it's interesting. And I mean, and here comes the cunning deception of the enemy. There's nothing new under the sun. We watched this from the beginning of Genesis. Did God really say? And so what I see here, and we talked about this, Carl, is that it seems like the whole focus then is world peace. Because, we read in, I think it's in Matthew 24 in the Olive Discourse, when I'm not sure if it's there, but when they say peace, peace, it's the beginning of sorrows. That the only peace that we can obtain is through Jesus Christ. When our minds are focusing on him, when we desire to do his will. But when you look at it in a natural and a carnal way of thinking, they're talking about a world peace that people are trying to progress towards. So let's talk about the progression of the church towards this one world peace. I know you had mentioned the Southern Baptist Convention or something like that at the United Nations.
Yeah, well, I do break that down quite a bit in chapter 11 of the book, where I talk about how the churches were involved, including the Southern Baptist Convention, back in the 1940s, putting in place declarations, statements supporting world government. So that was there then. And today, I'm still seeing examples of that. When I go to the Parliament of World Religions, when I have spent time at World Federalist, world government events, and it's been a little while since I've been to the last one. 2012, I was at a pretty big one. There is always this religious component. There is a spiritual side to it, an understanding that we need to bring in religious leaders. And what I'm finding today is as I'm looking at the direction that churches are going, we went from the emergent church movement now into progressive Christianity. There has been a shift, and the language that comes out of so many churches and so many denominations and so many seminaries is a progressive message, progressive voice. And it's all built around tolerance. It's built around oneness. It's built around how we have to all engage together in unity in order to really save the earth. Is that our message? Really?
We're going on a break. Please stay tuned. The best is yet to come with Carl Teichrib. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Love for the Truth Radio. We'll be right back, so please stay tuned. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, we read that men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, without self-control, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. They will be ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Thank you for having a love for the truth.
Welcome back. I'm Cindy Hartline, your host, and our guest we're in our final segment. Our guest, Carl Teichrib, is the author of Game of Gods, The Temple of Man in the Age of Re-Enchantment. You need to get a copy of that book. It's going to take you a while to read it, but every household should have this book because it really is explaining where we're going towards this new world order and what to watch out for and not to fall prey to the enemy's deception. And I know that's exactly, there's nothing new under the sun, exactly what Satan is doing, as he did in the Garden of Eden. Did God really say? We see this counterfeit deception rising up along with God's word and what he says the kingdom of heaven will be like, and how we're to press towards the peace and security in him, and not necessarily in the peace and security of a world peace and a new world order. So anyway, we are in our last segment with Carl Teichrib. Carl, there's just so much to talk about, and I love your book, and I do want to talk about, you mentioned Gene Stapleton, and I thought that was really interesting because, we have religious leaders who can be very influential and very powerful that are falling prey to this deception and leading many into that. But we also, even till this day, have Hollywood stars, actors that people follow that have a voice. And you had mentioned that Gene Stapleton was one of them, that she was all for world government. Why don't we talk about that?
Well, sure. And we were discussing that during the break. What's interesting is as I close up chapter 11 on the cult of world order, talking a little bit about how Gene Stapleton, along with other notable personalities of the day, John Denver, Walter Cronkite, Lloyd Bridges, all of these I just named, supported a global political authority. Wow. It's kind of crazy, but they all were supporting world government to some extent. In fact, Walter Cronkite gave a speech with the World Federalist Movement, and the World Federalist Movement is an NGO, a non-governmental organization, specifically created to help advance the idea of a world government. And so Gene Stapleton gave an endorsement to the World Federalists. Wow. Keep in mind, there you go, the NGO component. She talked about how this is so important because it brings about a vision of oneness. This comes about through tolerance. She talks about diversity. She brings all this into the language of redemption. I'm going to give you the quote and listen as all of those pieces from the NGO side to oneness to tolerance to redemption are packaged in this one quote. Here she goes. This is what she said. The goal of the World Federalists is peace through unity of government. We must support their vision of oneness in diversity, for it is the salvation of humanity. Wow. End quote. It says everything right there. Everything. And why? Why? For peace and for unity.
Yeah. There we go again. Redemption, salvation, using the same words that the Lord uses, the counterfeit uses those words, Carl, what I think really just struck me like, wow, is Walter Cronkite. I don't know why, but I must have missed that. I didn't remember that you had mentioned him in your book. Can you give us a little bit of information on Walter?
Oh, yeah. In fact, he was the most trusted man in America.
I know.
That was his title, a title everybody kind of gave him because he was noted as America's news anchor. If you would, back in the 70s, would turn on the television to watch late night news or to watch the news or whatever, you'd run into him. And he was a very important voice within the media. But a lot of people didn't know this. He was a strong, and I mean strong, advocate for world federalism. He was very close friends with major world federalists. Wow. Norman Cousins, who was a very big leader within the World Federalist movement. He had a connection with him. And back in 1999, Walter Cronkite was brought to the United Nations to sit down and have a special evening with the World Federalist group. They awarded him a Global Governance Prize for his work in promoting behind the scenes the importance of a new world order. Cronkite went into great detail talking about how he was so excited to receive this prize. Wow. In fact, let me just, I know this kind of is off of what some of our questions were earlier that we talked about, but here's just a little brief section from page 371 of my book. To deal with world problems, the news anchor, this is Walter Cronkite, preached, we need a system of enforceable world law, a democratic federal world government. Those are his words, Cindy, that he was giving to the United Nations when he'd received the Global Governance Award. Then he went on to talk about how religious right-wingers were equating this to be the work of the devil. And then Cronkite mockingly said, he says, I'm glad to sit here at the right hand of Satan.
Oh, my goodness.
Seriously, I've got it documented.
That is insane. Right, especially right. Walter Cronkite, because like you said, I mean, I grew up, I was young, but I mean, just like he was one of your most trusted men, during the time.
I know.
And to think that, that being such a strong advocate for federal world government, that he was sending messages, to us in ways that we probably didn't even know,
Okay. Yeah. Now let me just add one more little tidbit to this.
Sure.
Hillary Clinton couldn't attend the event. Now, there were other notable people who were in attendance. Michael Douglas, Catherine Zeta-Jones, the journalists Leslie Stahl and Ed Bradley. These are major figures, especially for that time. I mean, Michael Douglas and Catherine Zeta-Jones represented the Hollywood side of it. But First Lady, and this is back in 1999, First Lady Hillary Clinton couldn't attend personally, so she sent a personal video, and this is what she said. I'll read you the direct transcript from it. Good evening and congratulations, Walter, for receiving the World Federalist Association's Global Governance Award. We honor you for fighting for the way it could be. So there was no misunderstanding. She was supporting and praising this idea of global governance and supported Walter Cronkite's voice in providing that stable, constant message, really, that supported he was a supporter behind the scenes of world government. Gene Stapleton was, like I said, the list goes on.
Yeah. And all you need is a few influential people, like we talked about before, and there you have it. This message is getting out, and it's kind of like a message that we don't know is being. I'm saying it's subtle. It's like the enemy's subtle voice. It's very subtle. It infiltrates our culture sometimes without us knowing it. I didn't know if you wanted to go right into the green agenda that we talked about on the break, or do you have other things that you want to cover before that?
No, we definitely could. But one thing before we jump into that, I think, and I don't want to I'm how do I say this? I'm a lousy marketer, but let me tell you one thing. If you want the documentation and you want to be able to unpack what we have just been describing, Game of Gods literally gives you that roadmap.
Amen. Yeah, it does.
It's got 1,800 footnotes. You can go and explore the documentation yourself and get informed. I don't know of any other resource that's pulled it together as extensively as Game of Gods has. And so I know some of this information is going to be kind of, it's heavy, and people are going to be going, really? Guys like Walter Cronkite? Yeah, absolutely. And it is documentable. And that's really important for people to understand, Cindy, that what we're talking about is not it's not hearsay. It's not sensationalism.
No.
This is not rumor or innuendo. This isn't even conspiracy. It's not even conspiracy theory.
No, it's not. Not at all. I mean, the documentation that you have in your book is over the top. I've never seen so much documentation ever really in a book. So, I mean, we're talking about facts here, people.
And so my challenge to the Christian community is we need to recognize that we have succumbed to becoming as dumbed down as the culture around us.
Yes, you're right.
Let's instead of that, let's make a concerted effort to reach for higher goals and for the higher prize. Let's take the time to study, to learn, and to be informed, so that we can have a proper voice as ambassadors for Christ.
Yeah, and have proper discernment too as to the decisions we're going to make in life. I think of Isaiah 11:2. It says that when the Spirit of the Lord is upon us, it's the Spirit of knowledge, the Spirit of wisdom, the Spirit of counsel, the Spirit of understanding in the Holy Ghost and in the fear of the Lord. Part of our redemption, salvation and redemptive journey is all part of having knowledge, wisdom, understanding, and counsel of the Lord that we can use in our everyday life, and to know what we're going in, the direction that we're going into, and what we are going to stand for. And this is what Carl is talking about. We need to get this knowledge. We need to get this understanding to see that, in fact, as the world prophesies, that we are going towards a new world order. And we're going towards this not only the spirit of the Antichrist, but the Antichrist that will sit down, on the throne in the temple, which will be the abomination of desolation. But we need to know that we're we're not supporting that. That's the whole point. We don't want to support that. We want to stand on the common salvation that our Lord represents, and that Apostle Paul was talking about, the common salvation. Let us contend for the faith that was once delivered to the saints. So, okay, Carl, I think we want to touch on a little bit about the green agenda and where that's going.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's first and foremost right now in our faces.
Yes, it is.
You can't get away from it. I'm in Canada. We already are paying a carbon tax.
Wow.
In the United States, you're always talking about the Green New Deal. As we are recording this right now, the United Nations Climate Change Summit is taking place in Madrid. It's just it is its own religion. But what's important for people to recognize is that this is absolutely connected into what we have just been describing and talking about, the idea of global governance, world authority, a new world order. All of this absolutely ties into the green movement. In fact, that is one thing that is very readily documentable. And people need to recognize that the world, if you want world order or some type of world authority, you need something that you can rally the people around. It's world peace. It may be some external threat that all of a sudden is thrown at our face. And right now it's a global climate emergency. That's the language. The European Union just used that language. We have a global climate emergency. Here's this great big threat. We need to come together to save ourselves. And in so doing, we save the earth. Actually, they view it the exact opposite. We save the earth, and then we save ourselves by that.
Yeah, isn't that becomes the God? That definitely becomes the God, because there's more focus on saving Earth. In fact, I don't know where this comes up with. We have 12 more years to live. I don't know. But anyway, we're already going on a break, Carl. So we're going to have to do another show on this. But we'll be back with Carl Teichrib. He's going to give us his final advice, contact information, and book information. So please stay tuned.
You're listening to Love for the Truth Radio. We'll be right back. So please stay tuned.
I want to personally thank you for listening to Love for the Truth Radio. Please visit our website at www.loveforthetruthradio.com. That's www.loveforthetruthradio.com. Welcome back. We discussed so much today, the details of how the quest for global oneness has been on a worldwide agenda for decades. We talked about the cult of world order and spiritual politics, all of which are chapters found in author Carl Teichrib's truth-revealing book, one of my favorites, Game of Gods, The Temple of Man in the Age of Re-Enchantment. You need to get a hold of this book. I'm not a marketer either. Carl's not. But the thing is that it gives us so much information that if you have any questions about the New World Order, the One World Order, the religious One World, whatever, the peace, you can find it in his book. And you can talk about it. And we need to talk about it because we need to know what we don't want to be a part of. Carl has given us a wealth of information on this global oneness, and all of it's in his book, like I said. Carl, do you have any final advice? I know we could probably do a whole nother show on this, but what kind of final advice can you give our listeners that maybe have heard this for the first time and they're like, oh no, I'm part of this or I'm part of that, or they're in fear or whatever?
Right. Well, a couple of quick things. Number one, to understand this topic is important because we need to grasp what true salvation is as we see the world giving us a completely different salvation message, as the world gives us an alternative salvation story. And so we need to be firmly grounded in the true salvation that comes through Jesus Christ. Recognize that what we're seeing are counterfeits, and that what we are being given is an alternative version of salvation. And it's the world's version of salvation. When we grasp that, when we can see that, we can then be able to speak truth and to be ambassadors for Christ as the culture around us embraces this alternative salvation message as the culture around us is confused by it, we can begin to speak truth to it. And that's so important. And Cindy, that's why you're doing this show. That's why I wrote my book. That's why those of us in this realm of authors and speakers and radio hosts as Christians, we want people to be informed, not simply because the information is unique or it's interesting, but so that they can then use it in a way that exhibits wisdom.
Yeah, amen to that. Amen to that. And Carl, give us your contact information. If someone has a question, can they get in contact with you? And if so, how? And and where can they find your book?
Sure, you can find my book on Amazon. We've mentioned the title a few times, but it's Game of Gods, and the subtitle is The Temple of Man in the Age of Re-Enchantment. You can read excerpts, and you can find out a little bit more information about the book, and you can see some media clips of interviews on the book, and you can also contact me through my webpage. The book webpage is gameofgods.ca. gameofgods.ca, because I'm in Canada and it's a Canadian web address. And you can contact me. People can contact me through that. There is a forum that they can fill out. And if there's direct questions, that would be fantastic. Or the other thing you can do is follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook and I'm on Twitter. And I have I'm always putting information and different items up there too. So,
Can you give us our email address again, Carl?
The website is gameofgods.ca.
Gameofgods.ca. Visit that website. And Carl, it's been wonderful. I really totally enjoyed this show. God bless you and your family, and God bless you, listening audience. As always, big hugs. See you next time.